Welcome to a narrative battle report for Warhammer the Old World. So I think what I'm going to do is just give a brief overview of what we're doing, and I'll put more specifics in the description, and then I just want to jump right into the narrative and just make everything narrative. So my friend and I are doing the Conquest of the New World campaign, which is a campaign supplement to the regular Lustria campaign rules. We found them online. I'm not sure what edition they're from, but it's easy to adapt it to New World, or to the Old World. That's not a problem. Our campaign is my Lizardmen versus his Estalians, which, of course, technically in the rules are the Empire, but flavor wise, they're Estalians, they're from Estalia instead of the Empire. And this is the first official battle taking place at the coastal encampment location on the map, and we're using the beach landing scenario from the Conquest of the New World rules. I'm tweaking the rules for the start of the campaign a little bit just to fit the beach battle scenario better, but then after like the first round of the campaign, we're just going to use the rules as normal. And our goal is just to enjoy watching these games play out and develop a narrative. We're not trying to be competitive or get everything exactly technically right or anything. And it's a lot of fun to play like this. The campaign rules are great. They're very detailed, lots of special rules for different terrain and different scenarios, things like veteran honors for your unit. So it just makes the whole experience just very engaging and fun. And yeah, so without further ado, welcome to our Conquest of the New World campaign. Otesham stared unblinking at the ridgeline ahead, knowing that his quarry lay over that hill. Beyond the many trees and thick jungle undergrowth, the enemy was setting foot on the shores of Lustria. He was a venerable lizard, a Saurus old blood veteran of many wars. Over his tough red hide were scales yellowed with age, but hard as iron. The Slan had sent him, along with a group of his elite temple guard, to destroy the foe before they could gain a proper foothold. A small skirmish had been fought against the human scouting force, and though it was a clear victory, the determination and fighting skill of these men was made obvious. When skink scouts reported sighting the great vessels anchored off the coast, the Slan knew they would send more warriors, and that this time they would be better prepared. Otesham knew not why they came to Lustria, and it did not matter to him. He also did not understand the plans and labors of his Slan master, but that did not matter either. That these humans might interfere with his master's work was all he needed to know. He would stop them, whatever the cost. He did not hear the approach of the great skink, so skilled was the creature in navigating the undergrowth, but Otesham could smell him. Chief Quenkan, the skink leader charged with the defense of the outer jungles, responsible for the victory in the initial skirmish, came to give his report to the Saurus. Their warriors were assembled and ready, Quenkan told Otesham. They were the same warriors that took part in the skirmish. Two groups of skink skirmishers, though their number was only half what it had been in the previous battle, with many of the small warriors having been wounded by the enemy. 10 Saurus warriors and 3 Kroxigor, with the fourth still recovering from its wounds. Then there were the newcomers, Otesham and 12 of his heavily armed and armored temple guard, who were always ready. They would handle the toughest fighting, and so Quenkan had left behind his powerful magic scimitar, for all the skinks were now armed with short bows and would be dedicated to skirmishing. The heavy weapon would be unnecessary and slow him down. Otesham told Quenkan he respected the leadership the chief had demonstrated in his earlier victory. These warriors were his, and he could command them how he saw fit, as long as they did not get in the way of the old blood and his temple guard. Though Otesham was technically in command of this army, Quenkan was the brains behind the operation, and everyone knew it, including Otesham, and he was fine with that. He had risen to his position not through strategy, but through leading by example. He was the greatest champion of the Temple City. He fought on the front lines in countless battles, taking on the biggest and most ferocious foes his enemy had to offer and slaying them, a beacon of savagery for the Lizardmen to rally around. All he wished to do was find the greatest foes on the battlefield and lead his temple guards straight for them. The chief was effective at commanding his forces, so Otesham saw no reason to take that away and burden himself with strategic details. He would find the enemy general and kill him, while Quenkan led the rest of the forces. Not only was Otesham an ancient and powerful lizard, but he carried into battle a magical talisman of protection, as well as a magic blade, forged by the skink artisans of the city and empowered by the magic of the Slan himself. Such was their power that the talisman could potentially stop even the most lethal of weapons, and no armor was proof against his blade. Otesham was ready. He looked forward to the coming battle and hoped the enemy would put up a worthy fight. There was a great commotion on the beach as the Estalians prepared for battle. Men ran to and fro retrieving weapons and ammunition from the small boats they rowed ashore with. Sergeants shouted orders and infantry started forming ranks. Captain Esteban Del Mar oversaw the operation. He walked up and down the beach, making sure everything was as it should be, and barking curt orders where they were not. Minutes ago, the scouts had returned, bursting from the edge of the jungle and running down the gentle slope towards the water's edge, out of breath. The Lizardmen were coming. The captain had fought against them in the first battle. He was in command of the reconnaissance force, and he had seen many of his men die. In that battle, the enemy was composed mostly of the smaller Lizardmen, the skinks, and yet they struck with great ferocity, overpowering the overconfident Estalians. Esteban would not underestimate them again. He demanded that some of their best warriors and equipment be sent ashore first, as it was likely the enemy would try to stop them from establishing a beachhead. He wanted the very best to defend this operation. It would make this campaign nearly impossible if they failed to get a foothold here. 2 squadrons of knights stood ready, one on each flank. Those on the left were led by another Estalian officer, lower ranking than Esteban, but he was a proven fighter, a valorous man who had been awarded an enchanted greatsword for his deeds. In the center were the infantry, a large block of swordsmen and a smaller unit of halberdiers. To the left of the infantry was a unit of crossbowmen. At last, perhaps the most important part of the army, to the right of the infantry was a great cannon. The crew performed their final inspections and preparations under the direction of a skilled engineer. It took quite some effort to get the artillery piece ashore, but after the first battle, Esteban knew they needed more firepower. He himself was on foot for this battle. The greatest shock of the first battle was how easily the larger lizards had torn through his infantry. He knew it was they who needed him the most. Perhaps his fighting skills would not make the difference against such monstrous foes, but perhaps his leadership would. The captain had done one final pass. Everyone seemed to be forming up in good order, and the next group of rowboats was well underway. He stood with the swordsman and was in the process of double-checking that the flintlock pistols in his bandolier were properly loaded, when a great, bellowing roar sounded from the jungle up ahead, a primal sound from the most ancient nightmares of men. Esteban looked up, frozen for a moment as jungle birds fled squawking from the canopy, the sound of monsters crashing through the undergrowth following them. He threw off his fear and raised his blade, shouting for his men to steel themselves, for fortune and glory awaited them. The lizard host suddenly stepped out from the jungle. Creatures so alien to the humans it was as if they stepped from the most primordial depths of time into the waking world. The skinks were on the flanks, with Quenkan and the Croxagores on the lizard's right flank. The Saurus were at the center, led by the disciplined but swift advance of Otesham and his temple guard. As they emerged from the jungle, a Saurus at the front raised an intricate totemic standard high. At its top was a broad, leering face, and the moment it caught the sun it blazed with unnaturally bright light, reflecting the light over the battlefield as if the standard itself had become the sun. Many men stepped back a pace, covering their eyes in bewilderment, but a stern command from Esteban steadied them. Saurus, Old Blood, and Estalian captain both roared, and the two sides advanced towards battle. Most of the Estalians, however, did not advance far. Esteban was sure to learn as much as he could from the previous engagement, and he would not be overly aggressive. The swordsmen, halberdiers, and crossbows all rushed forwards a short way and then halted, just as an earth-shaking boom sounded behind them. The first cannonball hurtled forwards and struck true, exploding through one of the Saurus warriors. Esteban smiled, and a cry of approval went up from his men. It was the first time any of them had seen one of the larger lizards slain. Meanwhile, the knights continued their advance. He had ordered them to stop for nothing, and charge the first target that presented itself. No clever maneuvering like he had tried previously. The lizards were too quick. Quenkan scuttled forward with his skinks. They were reassured by the crashing footsteps of the Croxagores behind them, but the chief was worried. None of them had seen a gunpowder weapon so large as that cannon before, and its roar sent a shiver of fear through the skinks. What's more, it looked like the enemy had twice as many of the heavy horses this time. He knew his Croxagore would meet and halt any foe to protect the skinks, but he feared for those on the left flank, as he watched the knights barrel towards the skirmishers on the other side of the battle. But they were committed now. He hissed as viciously as he could and continued forwards with his warriors, focusing on the knights in front of them. There were several pockets of trees and undergrowth scattered across the field as the jungle slowly gave way to the beach, but on the left side the ground was more open and the knights there advanced swiftly. Fear gripped the skinks, but Chief Quenkan had instructed them to harass and slow the enemy as best they could, and so they would do their duty. They halted and sent a volley of poison-tipped arrows hurtling towards the foe. The knights were heavily armored, but the skinks had been hunting small game in the jungles all their lives, and they had studied the armor of the dead knights from the previous battle. They knew where to shoot and how. One of the arrows found its way through the visor of an Estalian, and he fell screaming from his mount. The rest of the knights carried on and dipped their lances. In the center, the Saurus advanced swiftly forward, their rage building as the threat to the lizards increased. The cannon boomed once again, and another Saurus fell. The engineer seemed to be worth his reputation indeed, but Esteban grit his teeth in frustration. He shielded his eyes and couldn't look directly at them, but knew the heavily armored Saurus were advancing uncontested. The cannon couldn't get an angle on them. He knew they were the greater threat, and ordered the crossbowmen to fire on them, despite their magical protection. Crossbow bolts and one of Esteban's pistol shots zipped through the air, but the Estalians could not take the time to aim properly with the blinding light, and their shots flew wide. Another knight fell to the poison arrows of the skinks, a worthy feat for the small lizards, but it was not enough. The remaining 4 crashed into them, lances and hooves felling skinks left and right as they desperately tried to evade their foes. Meanwhile, on the right side of the field, the other group of knights were nearing their target. Quenkan knew they were no match for these humans, especially without his scimitar, and so instead of firing, his skinks followed him as he quickly swerved to the left. The Croxagore knew what to do, and the mighty beasts bellowed as they stomped forwards to fearlessly meet the knights head-on. The Estalian officer raised his greatsword and shouted encouragement to his knights, and a heartbeat later, several tons of horse, man, lizard, and metal crashed into each other. The Croxagores swung as the knights closed, and 2 Estalians were toppled as the lizards' huge blades tore through their horses. One lance broke on a Croxagore's scales, and things would have been dire for the knights, but the other 2 lances were guided by expert hands into the belly of one of the great lizards, and it crashed to the ground dead. Unable to look at the foe in front of him, Captain Esteban cast his gaze swiftly over the rest of the battle. He saw the knights trampling the skinks on one side, and one of the huge lizards fall on the other. He grinned and raised his blade, shouting for his men to gird their loins and hold their ground as the Saurus neared. The swordsmen raised their shields, and the halberdiers leveled their weapons. The battle reached peak savagery as the Saurus joined the fray. The standard Saurus warriors had discovered that the cannon was far more of a threat than a man with a halberd, and they barreled into the Estalians. Their heavy metal shields, powered by bestial lizard muscle, turned aside the halberds, and then sharp obsidian blades went to work, swiftly rising and falling with gouts of blood, slaying all but 3 of the halberdiers. The survivors were those who broke and ran, and the Saurus pursued. However, they had hesitated for a moment for fear of the cannon, and thus the halberdiers were able to put some distance between them and their foes. Otesham was blind to all but the foe before him. His cold blood ran hot as he became a vessel of wrath, and his temple guard seemed infected by his rage. They slammed into the enemy, not bothering to use their shields, heedless of their own safety. In this way, the sharp swords of the enemy felled one of these ancient warriors, but many more Estalians died. The temple guard were not only much larger than a man and more savage, but they were the warrior elite of their kind. Their glaives struck with fury but also skill. Otesham smote down the first warrior he met and then paused, looked up and found his target, the one with the stern face and the big feathered hat, the enemy general. He stomped forwards, lowered his head, and roared. Esteban saw the great red lizard, spittle flying from its jaws as it bellowed at him, and it crossed his mind that this may be their leader, and it may be challenging him. Whatever it was doing, he knew he was not equipped to fight such a foe. He stepped backwards, holding his sword high and shouting encouragement. He thought it would better inspire his men for him to stand firm, even at the rear of the line, than for them to see the enemy feasting on his corpse. However, his men were terror-struck by the onslaught of their alien foe, and those that saw him step backward took it as a sign to retreat. The swordsmen began to break. As the swordsmen pulled away from their assailants, the crossbowmen desperately tried to fire on the temple guard, but when their eyes looked ahead, they were met with searing rays of light. They flinched, shut their eyes, or just looked away, firing blind. No Saurus fell. Meanwhile, the knights fighting the skinks had utterly broken them. They carried forwards with abandon, intent on running down every lizard they could get their hands on. The other squadron of knights, their charge over, circled the 2 remaining Croxagore. The beasts fended them off with wild swings of their great weapons, and the knights couldn't close, but their leader found an opening. One of the Croxagores lost its patience and lunged at a knight, catching the man with one huge claw and killing him with a snap of its jaws. But as the beast turned its back on the officer, he spurred his horse and charged in. His magic greatsword flashed through the air. Scale, flesh, and bone was severed, and a second Croxagore fell dead. The cannon crew worked frantically, but the engineer kept his cool, expertly directing them as they loaded the weapon with lethal grapeshot. He glanced up to see the lizards catch and slaughter the remaining halberdiers. Vengeance gripped his heart, Now was their chance. Boom! The cannon fired, and 2 swords fell at once, shredded by a hail of shot. Through much haranguing and swearing, Captain Esteban Del Mar at last rallied his men. They halted their flight and rallied around him, but shook as the Temple Guard came on once again. Esteban ordered the crossbows to keep firing to support him, and to their credit they tried, but at this point they were near blind, the light of the sun's standard clouding their eyes with great spots. They had no hope of hitting the foe. But Esteban stepped forward, planted a boot firmly in the sand, drew another pistol, and with his eyes burning and tearing, pulled the trigger and put a shot through the heart of a Temple Guard. He blinked and looked away, but it gave his men some shred of hope, and they stood their ground. The last Croxagore fell. There were too many foes. It desperately tried to fend them off, but as it turned towards one, another rode by, and their finely crafted swords slowly drew blood from the beast. At last it was ended as the officer charged once more, and beheaded the mighty lizard. The knights cheered. They had faced the most ferocious foe the enemy had to offer, and they had won. Quencan cursed himself. He had been indecisive. At first he wished to aid the Croxagore, but couldn't find an angle, and his skinks hesitated around the melee. Then he brought them forward towards the enemy crossbowmen, but they were too far, and now that the Croxagore were dead, he knew that they had to face the knights or die. He howled in frustration and ordered his warriors to give the knights everything they had. Fear left them as they sought vengeance for their Croxagore protectors, and their hands moved in a blur as they worked their bows. The knights' cheers of victory were cut short as arrows began to rain on them. As they turned to face the skinks, one knight fell. He and his horse stuck with arrows. Now there were only 3 of them, and the arrow storm continued unabated. The officer saw the nearby thick patch of trees at the jungle's edge and ordered his knights to make for it, seeking cover from the storm. As the knights retreated, Chief Quencan looked over his shoulder and saw the enemy crossbowmen advancing on his skinks. He spat and hissed, turning his vengeful warriors' attention to this new target. The crossbowmen were not prepared for the skinks' tireless archery, and without the heavy armor of the knights, 6 of them fell in moments. Half blind and with savage foes on 2 sides, they ran. Caught up in the slaughter of the halberdiers and dazed by the boom of the cannon so close, it took some time for the Saurus warriors to gather their wits and charge the cannon. The crew trembled as the enemy charged, but the engineer stood firm, his hand raised, waiting for the optimal moment. There! He dropped his hand and the weapon roared. A cloud of smoke erupted beside the engineer, and a cloud of gore erupted before him as all but 2 of the Saurus were blasted to pieces. The survivors continued on, but they were deafened, shaken, and for once in their long, cold lives, afraid. The engineer rallied his crew, and together they were able to fend off the beasts, holding them in a stalemate. The battlefield was a mess. Both sides had taken brutal losses, but at last the carnage would reach its climax as the Temple Guard met the swordsmen once again. The enemy general had refused Otesham's challenge. So be it. His men would pay the price. The revered magical blade of the old blood lashed out, cleaving through shields, blades, breastplates, and bone as if they were jungle fronds. The blind fury of the Temple Guard was too much for the swordsmen to bear, but they had nowhere to run. The water was near. The melee swiftly turned to slaughter as the guards dispatched the remaining swordsmen. Otesham heard a shout, and his berserk fury was finally interrupted. He looked back and saw Quencan hissing and shouting to his warriors, and then he saw the knights. He watched them trample the rest of the skinks on the far side of the battle, and he watched the other group charge for the jungle. The red lizard howled in rage. He could not let the foe enter the jungle. In his anger, he did not stop to consider the fact that the heavy cavalry would not be able to make it far into the jungle without support. Only the thought of them escaping and finding the hidden temple city crossed his mind. He looked back over his shoulder. He had not seen the enemy general fall, and he could not see him now amidst the carnage. Otesham gnashed his jaws in frustration. He wanted to be sure of the general's death, but could not let the enemy knights enter the jungle. He shouted to his warriors and brought them around, their wrath giving way to Otesham's command, and they ran for the jungle. Chief Quencan watched in dismay as Otesham left the beach. He waved his arms and yelled for the old blood's attention, but he was too caught up in his anger to heed the skink. Quencan looked out to the water and saw more boats of the enemy fast approaching. There were too few of them left. They could not hold the beach without Otesham. Captain Esteban gasped for breath, raising himself to his knees and clutching the wound at his side. Blood blinded one of his eyes, but he looked up to see the enemy depart. The knights fled into the jungle. Surely they feared the wrath of the Temple Guard, but they likely didn't run out of fear, but to draw the enemy away. The Red Lizard was blind with rage, and the knights used that to give the Estalian survivors a chance. Soon the rest of the Lizardmen followed. On the beach, the dead far outnumbered the living, but more boats would arrive in minutes. More boats brought fresh soldiers, more guns, and aid for the wounded. Eventually, Otesham would realize his mistake and come back to the edge of the jungle, only to see the enemy gathering in great numbers. He had failed. The Estalians had their foothold.